Day, and it's lovely to see so many mothers here as well. There's a lot of kids running around, which is great. But it's also a day for celebrating all things relating to mothering. And for me, I always see this day as a day to celebrate those who are also involved in my journey with mothering, and some of them are here today. But I'm aware this day can be really hard for some. But the good news is that Jesus is generous. He's generous with his time, his love, and more, as we see today. So we just heard our reading, which was from John 2. It's the wedding at Cana, which I think is quite a familiar story. It's a wedding where Mary, the disciples, and Jesus were invited, so it kind of suggests it was the wedding of a relative. On top of that, Cana is only a few miles away from Nazareth, where Jesus and his family lived. And some of you might know this, but weddings like this at the time would have been a week-long affair, with the bridegroom expected to meet the boss, which I actually think is quite unfair, but my dad, who's here today, would probably disagree. So Thursday, there we go, I wasn't sure if this would work. This is a really great cartoon I found. I thought it illustrates kind of Mary's position. It says, for those of you who can't see, it sure wasn't easy being the mother of Jesus. And the note she's holding says, "Dear Mom," if you're American or probably, "gone into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by Satan. Don't worry, Jenny." And I think that really illustrates the stress of being a mother sometimes. And as a mum, I think I know best when it comes to my childhood. For example, chocolate digestives aren't appropriate for breakfast unless we need to get out of the house and Josh dictates that that is the only way we're going to do that, which is more often I'd like to admit. But here, in this passage, Mary trusts Jesus. She gives herself fully over. She gives herself fully over to what he can do. She looks to him the solution for a socially embarrassing problem, yes, but it actually could have caused a lot of distress for her family in a shame-based culture. How tempting would it have been, and I say this with the full knowledge that I am exactly like this, how tempting would it have been for her to come up with an inadequate solution herself, to mobilise maybe some more people to come up with a very sort of, inadequate solution, to take things into her own hands and solve it. It could have given her a sense of security and control. But instead, she looks straight to Jesus. She is aware of his authority and temporarily sacrifices her own security. One of the biggest lessons I think mothering gives us is learning how to sacrifice. We sacrifice our energy, our time, our sleep, our sanity, and Mary illustrates this principle beautifully. She sacrifices her pride and her sense of control and gives it all to Jesus. Similarly, I think we should submit our worries and problems to Jesus' way of doing things, offering it up to him as we see Mary do in this passage. And look what happens. He responds to her by saying, "Woman, why are you involved with me? My hour has not yet come." And I actually found this really hard to read at first. It seems really rude. But actually, in the original Greek, it reads a bit differently. It's more like he's saying man. And some people have suggested this would be in order for him to distance himself from his mother, to symbolise what is about to happen. His ministry is about to begin. It's also an example of mum knows best. Mary knows what her son is capable of and the blessings he is about to give the newlyweds and their family. And that brings me on to my second point. Mary's privilege. This wedding was the first time Jesus had shown his ministry publicly. But Mary knew this power and the truth that he was the Son of God before. What a privilege. Like Mary, as Christians, we have the privilege to know Jesus as the Son of God, when the rest of the world doesn't. Psalm 14 says, "The fool in his heart says that is no God." So like Mary, because we have this relationship, because of what he did on the cross, we can turn to Jesus in times of need and get him to intervene. Jesus is so generous in how much we are involved with as Christians. In fact, generous doesn't even cover it. So I'll explain. We see in this passage that Mary tells the servants to do what Jesus tells them to. He finds 6 enormous jars of water, and these really were enormous. And these were used for ceremonial washing. These jars were used to make people clean, because as Mike kind of touched upon last week, there was a lot in ancient Jewish culture that would make people ritually unclean. Jesus takes these jars of water and he turns them into wine. And this foreshadows how Jesus has made us clean through his sacrifice on the cross, and through his resurrection will bring joy and fullness of life. It's interesting that in the passage after this, Jesus chases moneylenders out of the temple. He is here to cleanse and renew. So back to the passage, and the master of the ceremonies tastes the wine, as does the bridegroom, and they declare it is the best wine served at the wedding. I think we can often think of God as dull, looking everywhere else in our life for excitement and meaning. But just as this wine is the best, so life in Jesus is the best. All of this points to the ultimate act of generosity, and that is Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. His sacrifice means we are truly forgiven and reconciled to God. We can have a relationship with him because in his generosity, he took our place. And this whole story is hugely symbolic. It's not just about a wedding and a miracle, it's a sign. It's a sign of who Jesus is, but also what's to come for us. Jesus refers to himself as the bridegroom, and us as the church as a bride. And if you're really kind of excited by references, the one to look up is Matthew 9, verses 14 to 15, if you want one. But what does this mean about him? And what does it mean about us? A wedding and a marriage basically represent what Jesus is to us. He's a bridegroom who laid down his life out of love, as husbands are asked to do in Ephesians. The church as his bride is loved, and like in a wedding ceremony, one day we will be united to him. As a wife myself, I can say that marriage is pretty great. But during our wedding day, every day since, I'm reminded of what marriage symbolizes, what it represents, our relationship with Jesus. We have an incredible future in him, where he will come again and claim his church like a bride. And this is our privilege as his adopted children. And now on to Jesus' generosity. I think that sometimes we might forget how generous Jesus is. Or are we dictating what his generosity looks like? When he changes water into wine, are we asking for a rioja instead? Or to get more specific, are we disappointed when things don't happen at exactly the right time or in the way we would want it? It's at this point, it's worth reminding ourselves that our Heavenly Father knows best. Part of being a child is submitting to those who know best for you, no matter how much you tantrum. And I'm really hoping my son knows. And we've spoken about Jesus' generosity in providing a huge amount of wine and of such quality, and how that foreshadows a lot about how Jesus will be generous to us in the future. But what about now? This whole event was not just a miracle, it was a sign. But isn't it odd that Jesus' first sign of his ministry wasn't raising someone from the dead, parting a lake, or even healing someone? It was making sure someone avoided a socially embarrassing situation. I think it shows a lot about his character and how he walks along with us even now. It shows Jesus is humble and caring. it shows he really is involved in our lives and sees things from our perspective too. He's not only concerned with international affairs, but he's also involved in things that we might find really difficult. And as a mum, I really, really love that about Jesus. I know a small thing for me at the moment is how I cope and act when Josh is tantruming. We are at that stage, yes, it is tough. But I know that Jesus is with me because of passages like this. He saw the situation that the wedding party might end up in. He intervened. He is involved in the small things. He is involved in the everyday and can work miracles. I've often found him answering massive prayers for me as well as the little ones. For example, recently we were told by nursery that Josh's speech wasn't really where it should be. He worrying and thinking about what we should do and trying to put all sorts in place. And actually I found myself at night praying that God would connect the things in his brain that would mean he could speak more in sentences. And only a week later, nursery explained to us that he had come so quickly in his speech that they were no longer worried. God is so generous, but that can be really easy to forget or even involve him at all. He can give us strength when we face small battles like putting a child to bed, or big challenges like infertility or loss. He is willing to meet us in our everyday things. We just have to invite him in, as Mary did. Jesus expresses his kindness in 1,000 different ways, and I'm a major gift giver. I love giving gifts, but Jesus blows every single one out of the water. And he is generous with the most precious gift of all, himself. So this Mothering Sunday, remember that you are a child of the living God. Remember that you are part of an incredible future. And most importantly, you have access to his generosity. He is generous with himself, pouring out on all of us.